In XSI, everything can be defined as a cluster. The entire object can be a single cluster. Individual components such as edges, polygons, or points can also be defined as a cluster. If I were to go into polygon here, simply by selecting, I'm going to grow this selection. Just going to frame it up. I'm now happy that that's going to be a cluster. I can simply click on cluster, and there we go, a polygonal cluster has been created. If I were to do things like edges, so I have edges here around a tusk. Same thing, if I click on cluster, and now an edge cluster has been created. Edge clusters are very useful for defining seams, as well as the potential for boundary edges. So clusters can be used for selection sets, as well as applying operators. So with this edge selected, I can do something like disconnect the component. So I now have an operator on the edge. I can also use it for things like enveloping. With this enveloped, I could select one half of my body and mirror those envelope weights to the other side. So when I'm starting to create my model, I start to create clusters for various things. So if I were to do texturing, let's say in my head, if I were to open up the texture editor here, I can simply select clusters and they will update inside the texture editor. This means that when I start to do UV editing, it's much easier for me to select and manipulate based on a simple selection set. A cluster can also have a material on it. Here in hidden line mode, I can see my clusters quite well. If I were to apply a material to a cluster, in this case a polygonal cluster, when my object is unselected, I can very easily see where the cluster is. In addition, I can also turn on unselected clusters. So now I have point clusters as well as polygonal clusters. Every time a cluster is created, here like the tusk, if I hit enter, I can change the cluster color simply like that. So now it's a bit darker, like so. So it's a very easy way for me to start to identify those clusters. And of course, simply by going to something like polygonal mode, selecting cluster, I can just select parts that I want to manipulate, like so. So you can use clusters simply for selection sets, to apply operators on, or to use as texture markers, or for things like identifying envelope weights.